Have you ever wandered through a cemetery and felt something unsettled tug at the edge of your awareness? A quiet detail that didn't belong, a shape or scale that whispered something other than grief. For most visitors, a graveyard is a place of stillness, of solemn tradition. But scattered across the old cemeteries of the world, across the fog-drenched hills of Pennsylvania, the green churchyards of England, the shadowy rows in Leipzig, there are monuments that do not conform. They do not mourn. They stand. They loom. And they raise questions far louder than any epitaph ever carved. These are not ordinary tombstones, not slabs with gentle arcs and wilted flowers chiseled into fading stone. These are monoliths. Some stand 3 or even 4 meters high. Their bases are so thick they resemble the footings of machinery, not memorials. Their weight ranges from 1 to 4 tons. Massive structures set atop the graves of people who, according to surviving records, had no fortune, no noble lineage, no fame, and yet they were buried beneath monuments that could anchor a suspension bridge. This is no metaphor. These stones feel engineered, not carved. They bear marks of manufacture, threaded holes, circular depressions laid out with the geometric precision, surfaces smoothed so flat you'd expect to find them on a lathe, not in a graveyard. Before we go deeper, if this kind of buried mystery intrigues you, make sure to subscribe to the channel now. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. We're building a global circle of late-night thinkers. And if this story stirs your curiosity, share it with someone who might understand what the title is really asking. Why are these tombstones too big for the people buried beneath them? One such stone stands in a small cemetery just outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It marks the grave of a man named James Whitmore, who died in the year 1891. The marker is enormous, nearly 3 meters tall, its granite base measuring over 40 centimeters thick. A stonemason who examined it in 2019 estimated its weight at over 2 tons. And yet, Whitmore was no industrial titan. The records show him as a laborer, no surviving family, no estate in probate court. The local government lists no payment records for the monument, yet the stone stands unwavering, and carved into its surface are only the most minimal of words: James Whitmore, 1847 to 1891. No Bible verse, no loving memory, no poetic inscription. Just a name, and dates, and a weight of silence. That should have been the end of it. One strange monument, one local anomaly, perhaps a mystery lost to time. A grieving patron will never know. But the pattern doesn't stop there. Monuments with the same impossible size and strange structural features appear in other cemeteries, in other countries, under other names, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, even as far away as Eastern Europe. Researchers have documented gravestones with identical shapes, identical construction, and identical engineering clues. 4 depressions at the base, arranged in a perfect square, a threaded hole at the top, as if something was once mounted and then removed. Traces of copper oxidation suggest contact with metal, and the position of each stone, its compass alignment, follows a pattern too precise for chance. Old photographs hint at what might once have been attached. A recently digitized print from 1891 shows a group of cemetery workers standing next to a Whitmore-style monument. But this time, a strange object sits atop the stone, a polished sphere, metallic and smooth, mounted like a crown. It reflects light. It gleams. And in all later photographs of the same monument, it is gone, erased from stone, erased from memory. This is where the story begins to fracture, to splinter into something deeper. Because if the monument was not built simply to mourn the dead, if the threaded hole, the mounting surface, and the sphere atop it suggest function, not fashion, then the monument is not what it claims to be. And what does that imply? If these stones were never meant to honor the dead, then the graves they mark may not be graves at all. They might be nodes in a system, anchors of something larger, infrastructure masquerading as memory. That is the theory posed by a growing number of independent researchers, engineers, historians, archivists, who have started to see these monuments not as symbols of loss, but as blueprints of a forgotten architecture. They ask different questions. Not who is buried here, but what. Not what is carved on the stone, but what once sat atop it, and why was it removed? The implications are staggering, Because to ask those questions is to suggest something deliberate, something hidden. And if these stones were components in a network built before the age of wireless electricity, before the word resonance entered the public vocabulary, then someone built that network. Someone placed each stone with intent, calculated each angle, spaced each monument with mathematical care, and then someone dismantled it, quietly, systematically, removing the mounted components, altering the records, replacing truth with trivia. What remains is heavy and undeniable. Stone does not lie. It does not decay like paper. It cannot be erased like ink. It endures. And these monuments endure, massive, precise, inexplicable, scattered across the globe. They mark not just forgotten lives, but perhaps forgotten knowledge, forgotten power. Why do they all face the same direction? Why do they follow the same spacing? Often exactly 3.14 meters apart, a measurement suspiciously close to the first 3 digits of pi? Why do they appear only in a tight historical window between the 1860s and the early 1900s, and then vanish from all future cemetery records? Who ordered them built? And who ordered them dismantled? If you're the kind of person who notices what others walk past, who sees pattern where others see coincidence, then you're in the right place. Because this isn't a ghost story. It's a question about how much of our past was quietly edited while we were too busy grieving to notice. And the more you look, the more that question grows. Because sometimes, what we assume are tombstones turn out to be something else entirely. Not tributes to the dead, but technology buried beneath mourning. The cemetery outside Pittsburgh is still there. The iron fence rusts quietly in the shadows. The grass is long, and the light filters through the old oaks with a softness that almost disguises the weight beneath. The Whitmore stone remains. 2 tons of unanswered questions, 1 name, 2 dates, and a mounting hole that still waits for something long removed. Walk 50 meters north from the Whitmore stone, just past the newer graves and the crumbling mausoleums from the early 20th century, and you'll find it. A strip of land forgotten by landscaping crews, untouched by footpaths, and ignored by cemetery maps. The grass is coarser here, thicker, as if it resents being stepped on. Trees older than memory spread their limbs wide, their roots gripping the soil with the slow confidence of centuries. And nestled under their shade, arranged with unsettling precision, stands a row of 17 oversized monuments. They do not belong. The stones are nearly identical, 2 to 3 meters high, cut from the same type of granite, with the same impossible base thickness. But it isn't the size that gives them away. It's the engineering. Each monument displays 4 circular depressions on the top surface of its base, 5 centimeters in diameter, arranged in a perfect square. The spacing between them is not approximate. It is exact, 31 centimeters from center to center. These are not decorative flourishes. A grieving family does not request mechanical tolerances. Move from one monument to the next, and the pattern continues. The second stone is for Thomas Garrett, died in 1879. The third for Eleanor Marsh, died in 1883. The fourth, fifth, sixth, all with different names, but the same design. Flat mounting platforms, threaded central holes, traces of oxidized metal staining the stone faintly green. These are not gravestones. They are installations. Locals call this area the Old Industrial Section, though no one can say why. Harold, the cemetery groundskeeper since 1987, shrugs when asked. He says it was always called that. His predecessor used the same phrase. And yet, there is nothing industrial here. No machines, no smokestacks, no records of any business having operated within the bounds of this land. Just 17 gravestones no one remembers commissioning. For people no one remembers knowing. Historian Patricia Vance spent 3 years researching this part of the cemetery. Her findings, published in a regional heritage journal in 2014, only deepened the mystery. According to Vance, not one of the 17 individuals buried in this row appears in the federal census of 1880. No birth certificates, no marriage licenses, no property ownership. The only records are the stones themselves and a single cemetery ledger that lists each burial as paid in full, no family contact. 17 people with no histories, no descendants, no paper trail. Vance's tone was careful, as if she feared saying too much. Her conclusion stopped short of conspiracy, but its implications echoed with quiet urgency. The uniformity of design and absence of personal documentation suggests these monuments were installed by an institution, not families. Who that institution might have been, she could not determine. When she proposed a ground-penetrating radar scan of the row, her request was denied. No reason given. The rejection came in a single sentence. "Your request has been reviewed and denied." She retired the following year and has not spoken publicly on the matter since. These stones curve slightly across the landscape, not haphazardly, not randomly, but in a deliberate arc. Their alignment points east-northeast, 70 degrees from true north. Each base faces that direction precisely, regardless of terrain. This isn't the work of grieving relatives choosing a spot for aesthetic reasons. It's the work of planning, of design, like an array, like a machine. The final stone in the row stands slightly taller than the others, over 3 meters, and its inscription has been forcibly removed, not worn away by time, but chiseled out deliberately. The stone bears fresh gouges where letters once were. Its top is different. 2, instead of 4 circular bolt depressions, it features a single rectangular slot, 15 centimeters long and 10 deep. The inner walls bear the telltale oxidation of copper. Whatever was once mounted here had conductive properties, and someone took the time to erase not just the device, but the identity of the person beneath it. In a normal cemetery, 1 anomaly is a curiosity, 2 are a coincidence. But 17, in a geometrically aligned row, with shared specifications and no documented background, is something else. It is a system, and when a system leaves no names, no families, and no memories behind, it suggests something chilling, that remembering was never part of the plan. The more you stare at the stones, the more wrong they feel. Even the texture of the granite seems alien, machine-smoothed, not hand-carved. The mounting platforms are level with a precision that would be difficult even today. In the 1880s, it would have been nearly impossible outside of an industrial workshop. And yet, here they are, in the quiet grass, pretending to be gravestones. What were these stones really built for? Who decided they should stand here, in a forgotten row in Pennsylvania? Disguised as memories, the evidence says they are not alone. Other rows exist. Other cities hold similar secrets. But this row, the first to be documented in full, tells us something vital. These were not isolated acts. This was coordinated. Someone chose this place. Someone built this configuration. And someone, somewhere, removed what once stood atop these platforms. There are no photographs of these stones from the time they were built. No family portraits. No dedication ceremonies. No obituaries in the local papers. 17 people. 17 heavy markers. And no one to visit them. No flowers. No candles. No grief. Just cold geometry. Silent mass. And the faint echo of machinery lost to time. When you walk away from the row, something follows you. Not a sound. Not a shape. A question. One that grows louder the farther you get from the grass and the silence. If these were not memorials, then what were they meant to support? And why has every trace of that purpose been so carefully erased? November of the year 2017. A retired mechanical engineer named David Ashworth visited St. Michael's Churchyard in Manchester, England, to photograph his grandmother's grave, a quiet ritual he had maintained since her passing in 1994. The site was familiar, as were the paths and the modest stones lining them, but this time, something shifted. He had brought a new camera, one with sharper resolution and a stronger zoom, and when he reviewed the photos that evening, he saw something behind her grave he had never truly noticed before. 11 massive stones, silent, towering, set in a row behind the modest headstones. Each stood between 2 and 3 meters high. Each base bore the same engineering marks described in Pennsylvania. 4 circular depressions, spaced in a perfect square, each depression 5 centimeters wide, spaced exactly 31 centimeters apart. Metal staining was faint but visible. Ashworth zoomed in, adjusted contrast, and realized he had found the same phenomenon described by Patricia Vance. But on the other side of the world, His discovery added a crucial piece to the growing puzzle: two sites, two countries, and the same inexplicable engineering. This was no longer a local mystery. It was a pattern, and patterns of this precision are not formed by grief or coincidence. Ashworth, trained in machine design and precision systems, knew immediately that what he was seeing had nothing to do with memorial artistry. These were not ornamental flourishes. These were mounting surfaces, built for exact tolerances, the kind you'd expect on a machine, not a memorial. He contacted local historians, but they dismissed his interest. Victorian families, they said, often built elaborate gravestones. It was a sign of mourning, of wealth, of social status. That explanation was tidy. It was also deeply incomplete. Because the stones Ashworth documented, like those in Pennsylvania, were not inscribed with poetic language, religious symbols, or family crests, they were austere, blank slabs with names, dates, and no further context. What's more, the names were of people with no known wealth, no titled status. One man, Arthur Jennings, was listed in a local registry as a carpenter. Another, Martha Pritchard, was recorded as a laundress. These were working-class individuals, yet their graves were marked by stones that would have cost a fortune to produce and install. According to 19th century catalogs, such monuments would have cost several £100s, a cost far beyond the reach of most families, especially when multiplied by 11. And that cost was not just in the stone. Transport, foundation laying, leveling of the base, all required equipment and manpower that ordinary mourners could not afford. Even more unsettling was the design consistency. Victorian-era gravestones came in endless styles: draped urns, Gothic crosses, angels in mourning, Celtic knots. But none of the stones behind Ashworth's grandmother bore these designs. They were unornamented, geometrically uniform, and structurally identical to those in Pennsylvania. Threaded holes, smooth-cut platforms, copper oxidation, stone prepared not for mourning, but for mounting. In the weeks that followed, Ashworth compared measurements with those documented by researchers in the United States. The numbers matched, not approximately, exactly. Bolt spacing, base width, height, every metric fell within the same narrow tolerances. Across an ocean, across decades. How? This kind of precision doesn't happen through fashion. It happens through standards. In engineering, standards exist to ensure compatibility, stability, replication. They are not arbitrary, they are deliberate. The presence of the same physical standard across continents suggests a manufacturing system, a coordinated effort. This raised a more troubling question. If the stones were built to standard, then they must have been ordered, designed, delivered, installed, not as art, not as symbols, but as components, which leads us away from the comforting realm of memory and mourning and into something colder: infrastructure. The Victorian vanity explanation begins to falter under scrutiny. Could some wealthy families have commissioned massive monuments to honor their dead? Absolutely. There is a long tradition of architectural mourning, from the pyramids of Egypt to the mausoleums of emperors. But those are the exceptions, and they are highly individualized. These stones are not, they are standardized, depersonalized, built with such eerie similarity that they suggest not sentiment, but a template. So, what would require dozens, perhaps hundreds, of 3-meter-tall granite monuments with identical mounting holes, facing the same compass direction, with spacing that matches known electromagnetic wavelengths? What were they part of? A photograph from the early 1900s adds a haunting clue. Found in a library archive in Birmingham, it shows a worker standing beside one of these towering stones. Perched on top is an object, a metallic sphere roughly the size of a man's head, mounted on a short cylindrical base. The sphere reflects light strangely, with a polished surface that seems too modern for its time. Within a few years, every image of that site shows the same monument, but the sphere is gone. Decorative? Perhaps. But the mounting precision, the copper residue, the threaded holes, these aren't decorative features, they're structural. Spheres of that size and weight require anchoring, stabilization. And if they weren't decorative, then what were they? The theory emerging among independent researchers is both outrageous and rational, that these weren't memorials at all, but nodes in a resonant system, that the spheres were not art but function, receivers, transmitters, elements of a wireless electromagnetic network built in the shadows of a world not ready to understand it. In this view, the monuments are infrastructure hidden in plain sight, graves that were never meant to honor individuals, but rather to hide something: the base, the mounting, the stone itself. All camouflage. A gravestone draws no questions, no suspicion, and no one questions why it weighs 2 tons or 0.70 degrees east of north. But now we are questioning, and that question is spreading across countries, across disciplines. From stonemasons to electrical engineers, something was built in the late 19th century, something we were never supposed to see, and then, just as suddenly, it vanished. The winter of 1889 settled heavily over Leipzig, Germany, the kind of cold that makes even granite seem warm by comparison. On the outskirts of the city, a new cemetery known as Südfreihof had begun construction. Plans drawn by the city's architectural office showed a symmetrical layout of tree-lined avenues and equal-sized burial plots, sorted by district and class. Neat, predictable, German, and yet, in the earliest surviving photographs of the site, dated November of that same year, there is something no plan ever mentioned. 17 towering granite monuments, not in the center, where honored graves should be, not even among the rows planned for elite burials. Instead, they stand along the eastern boundary wall, already in place before the first official burial occurred. In the foreground of the photograph, a line of laborers pose stiffly for the camera. Behind them, the stones loom dark, silent, and fully installed, as if they had been waiting before the cemetery was born. But the plans don't show them. No mention of these 17 markers appears in the official architectural registry. The City Planning Commission's approval documents list no expenditure for their materials, no authorization for their installation, and the dedication speech, reprinted in the March edition of Leipziger Tageblatt, makes no reference to them whatsoever. The monuments simply appear, present in reality, absent in record. A young architecture student named Lucas Brenner first noticed this discrepancy in 2018 while working on a thesis about cemetery design in the German Empire, curious about early cemetery planning. He accessed Leipzig's municipal archives and requested the original blueprints for Südfreihof. The documents he received were clear and precise, and they were missing 17 giant stones. Puzzled, Brenner asked to view early photographs of the site. The archivist handed him a folder labeled Pre-Construction Imagery. Brenner scanned through them and froze. The stones were there, in every image, already standing. He brought the photos and plans to the archivist and asked the obvious question: which version was correct? The reply was carefully worded. The photographs may have been misfiled. The site plans represent the official record. End of conversation. Brenner knew what most researchers eventually learn. Official does not always mean true. The Leipzig stones shared every strange feature found in Pennsylvania and Manchester. The same bolt patterns. 4 circular depressions, 5 centimeters wide, 31 centimeters apart, arranged in a square, the same base thickness, around 40 centimeters, the same mounting platforms at the top, each with a threaded central hole, copper oxidation around the openings, inscriptions naming individuals who appear in no birth records, no death registries, no family genealogies, 17 names, 17 ghosts. Brenner posted his findings to an online forum dedicated to architectural anomalies. Within weeks, responses poured in. Amateur researchers across Germany, Frankfurt, Munich, Cologne, Hamburg, shared their own photographs of oversized cemetery monuments, and the pattern held. Some photos showed the familiar spheres still mounted on the stones, just barely visible in faded grayscale, catching the sun in a way that made them seem alive. In others, the objects were half removed, tilting as if caught in the act of vanishing. One photograph from Hamburg showed something new, a different shape atop the monument, not a sphere, but a flared cylinder with faint ridges around its base. Another from Munich showed what might have been a conical object, though the image was damaged and hard to interpret. Different cities, different designs. But the mounting method remained consistent: stone platform, precision holes, and traces of metal where contact had once been made. Brenner began mapping the data. By mid-year, his map showed more than 200 confirmed locations across 3 continents. Each site contained monuments with the same physical design language: oversized dimensions, precise spacing, threaded mounts, oxidized residue, and each site dated to the same 50-year window, from the early 1860s to around 1920. Then, suddenly nothing. The design vanishes from catalogs, the monuments vanish from new cemeteries, the records fall silent. That silence was not passive, it was enforced. As Brenner compiled evidence, he noticed something else. The records at these cemeteries didn't just omit the monuments, they actively contradicted their existence. One small churchyard in Bavaria, for example, described an eastern section as containing temporary wooden crosses only, and no mention of granite markers. Yet, in a photograph dated 1916, that same section contains 9 massive stones, already weathered, clearly present for years. A cemetery in suburban Philadelphia lists an entire row of plots as vacant, reserved for future use. Yet, a researcher's on-site photos show each plot filled, each with a towering monument dated to 1891. In England, a parish burial register describes 11 graves as having modest stones under 1 meter tall, but the stones standing today are nearly 3 meters, each weighing over 2,000 kilograms. When contacted, the parish staff offered no explanation. These were not missing records, they were falsified records. Someone went to great lengths not just to erase the truth, but to replace it, to create noise that would drown out the signal. Normal graves, normal stones, normal history, a fiction designed to stand unquestioned, and it worked. For over a century, no one looked closely. No one thought to measure, to ask why a laundress was buried under 3 tons of granite, why a monument pointed precisely 70 degrees east of north, why the metal stain at the top formed a perfect ring, as if a device had once sat there humming quietly beneath the sky. This isn't about artistic tradition anymore, it's about control. Across Leipzig, as in Manchester, as in Pittsburgh, someone built these stones to do something. And when that function was no longer needed, or perhaps no longer allowed, that someone removed the evidence, leaving only the heaviest parts behind. The stones could not be taken without notice, so they remained, empty, but not harmless. Witnesses to a system that once connected the earth in ways we are only beginning to guess. And the most disturbing truth? The names on the stones may not just mark the dead. They may mark the workers who built the system, people who were buried under its weight, literally. Graves chosen not for love, but for location. Deaths memorialized not by family, but by function. The system did not just use their labor, it used their bodies. In Leipzig, one of the monuments bears a name chiseled so faintly it's nearly illegible. Brenner enhanced the photo. The name appears to read Johann Reisner. He searched civil records. Nothing. No marriage, no employment, no death notice. But in a dusty university archive, he found an 1888 roster of telegraph technicians. The name was there. Line 7. Position, relay station maintenance. The past is not always buried. Sometimes it's mounted in plain sight, on platforms of stone, under names we were told not to remember. It begins with a photograph, tucked away in the digitized archives of the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. The year marked on the back is 1891. 3 cemetery workers stand shoulder to shoulder, stiff and unsmiling in heavy canvas shirts and suspenders. Boots caked in the clay of Allegheny County. Behind them rises a monument. Not the usual kind. This one towers over them, nearly 3 meters high, thick at the base, tapering toward the top, but it's the apex that freezes the breath in your chest. Mounted there, on the smooth granite platform, is a sphere, metallic, polished, slightly larger than a human head. It rests atop a narrow pedestal, its curvature almost too perfect for the age. Around its equator, a faint ridge or band seems to separate 2 halves. It glints in the sunlight, casting a shadow along the base of the monument, like a sundial measuring something more than time. This image had never been published. It was found by accident, buried under a generic catalog label, Cemetery Workers, Allegheny County, 1891. No one knew it existed until a local researcher ran a search on a whim and stumbled upon it. She requested the original. The library responded, not available, misfiled, possibly lost. The digital scan was all that remained, and in that scan, the sphere loomed, obvious, undeniable, and in stark contrast to every other surviving image of that monument taken after 1920. In those later photographs, the sphere is gone. The pedestal remains, but the mount is empty. What was it? At first glance, one might assume decoration. After all, Victorian funerary art had a love of embellishment, urns, angels, crosses, obelisks, but spheres? Almost never, particularly not large metallic ones. Nor are there any catalogs from the period offering such items as headstone toppers. And even if they were stylistic choices, why do they vanish from every site, always within the same narrow window of time? Decoration does not vanish by order. Function does. A second theory offered by skeptics is illumination. Could the spheres have been early gas lamps or arc lights? Some cemeteries in the late 19th century did install lighting, symbolic perhaps, or for nighttime mourning rituals. But if these spheres were meant to light the grounds, where are the pipes? Where are the wires? The photograph shows no infrastructure, no mounts, no power lines. The workers pose in full daylight, the shadows long, but no fuel source is visible. No fittings, no hoods, just the sphere, sitting silently like it belongs in a laboratory, not a graveyard. Then there's the third theory, the one that whispers when all others fall silent. What if these were not ornamental at all? What if they were part of something technological? Between 1880 and 1900, the world was on the edge of electrical revolution. Nikola Tesla spoke of wireless energy, of resonance, of invisible power transmitted through the air itself. Guglielmo Marconi would soon send his first wireless telegraph signals across vast distances. The air was beginning to buzz with potential, and the idea emerged. Could these metal spheres have been passive receivers, or even transmitters, part of a network built not to mourn the dead, but to reach through space, through time, through fields of force no eye could see? It's not so implausible. A polished, conductive sphere, mounted high on a stone pedestal, grounded through tons of granite into the earth below, could serve as a resonant node in an electromagnetic system. It could collect ambient energy. It could pulse, receive, even relay, especially if arranged in patterns, in rows, in curves that matched certain harmonics, especially if spaced precisely, as many of these monuments were, at distances that aligned with the wavelengths of low-frequency transmission. Another image emerged 3 months after the Pittsburgh photo. This time, from a municipal archive in Leipzig, another cemetery, another stone, another sphere. The shape is unmistakable. The angle of sunlight is different. The stone slightly taller, the pedestal narrower, but the object is the same, a gleaming metal orb perched on a base, catching the light. It is not blurred, it is not speculative, it is real. 2 photos, 2 continents, 1 repeating shape. What makes this more disturbing is what followed. After those years, the spheres vanish, not just physically, but historically. They do not appear in records, in maintenance logs, in catalogs of cemetery ornamentation, no budget allocations, no purchase orders, no salvage records, nothing. And that absence, so perfectly consistent, is louder than any presence, because removal always leaves a trace, a bolt snapped, a stain left behind, a chip in the stone where a crowbar pressed too hard. The mounting holes on these monuments are not weathered. They are clean, intentionally cleaned. No rust, no debris, no accidental decay. It is as if someone removed the spheres and scrubbed every trace of their existence. Except for the stones, too heavy to move, too expensive to destroy, too stubborn to forget. The implications deepen when we examine the purpose of the design itself. Engineers have noted that the flat granite bases would offer ideal stability for heavy electromagnetic components. The 4 mounting holes offer secure balance. The orientation, 70 degrees east of north, aligns across hundreds of monuments, far too exact for happenstance. And when that orientation points to Greenwich, the prime meridian, the 0 point of global timekeeping, a new layer unfolds. Perhaps these were not only communicators, but synchronizers, markers in a hidden system of resonance and reference. Why cemeteries? Because no one questions a tombstone. Because a graveyard is stable, permanent, unlikely to be disturbed. Because you can build there without raising eyebrows. And because, perhaps, the people buried beneath were chosen for more than just their proximity. Maybe they were part of it. Participants, engineers, technicians, human components of a system forgotten on purpose. What little we have now comes from these fragile relics, stone markers, aged photos, discoloration where metal once touched granite, but they tell a story if you're willing to listen. Not a ghost story, but a story of buried knowledge, a technology older than we thought, erased cleaner than most crimes, and remembered only by the mass of rock no one dared haul away. The photographs are rare, the archives are few, but the stones remain, the threaded holes remain, and somewhere, perhaps still buried in a drawer or mislabeled folder, the next image waits. Another sphere, another clue, another moment where memory refuses to vanish. In the spring of 2021, a small but determined group of researchers began comparing notes. Most of them had never met. Some used aliases. Their backgrounds varied: mechanical engineers, amateur historians, retired archivists, even a few curious electricians. What united them was a shared obsession with the strange monuments, the oversized stones, the threaded holes, the missing spheres. These researchers began calling themselves the Survey Group. No hierarchy, no institution, just a shared drive to document what no one else was willing to measure. They devised a checklist, 12 items to gather consistent data across the world. The list included monument height, base dimensions, stone type, presence of bolt holes or slots, visible metal stains, compass orientation, spacing between stones, inscription details, and whether the monument appeared in official cemetery records. Each volunteer committed to documenting at least 5 stones a month. The goal wasn't to prove anything, it was to establish facts, measurements, orientation, material evidence. Within weeks, the data began rolling in, from England, from the United States, from Germany, and even Eastern Europe. More than 300 monuments were surveyed by midsummer. Some measurements were meticulous, taken with laser levels and digital compasses. Others were done discreetly with measuring tape and notepads, careful not to draw attention from cemetery staff. But even with variation in precision, the pattern emerged, and it was undeniable. 87% of surveyed monuments had bases between 30 and 45 centimeters thick. 92% had at least one circular depression or threaded hole at the top. 78% displayed metal staining consistent with copper or bronze oxidation. But the most striking consistency was orientation. 100%, every single monument measured, faced a heading between 60 and 80 degrees east of north. Every single one, not approximately, not most, every single one. Graves often face east. In Christianity, the east symbolizes resurrection. Jewish and Islamic burial practices also use directional alignment, toward Jerusalem, toward Mecca, but these monuments did not face due east. Their compass heading consistently landed near 70 degrees, an angle that does not align with any known religious tradition. What lies at 70 degrees east of north? From Pittsburgh, from Manchester, from Leipzig. The bearing points almost precisely to Greenwich. England, the location of the prime meridian, the place where time officially begins. It was standardized in 1884. Right within the same era these monuments began appearing. Coincidence? Perhaps. But when every stone, across nations and languages, shares that alignment, coincidence starts to look more like calibration. Orientation alone might not be enough. But the survey group found another consistency: spacing. The distance between each monument in the known rows varied slightly depending on terrain and layout. But when averaged, the number kept repeating: 314 centimeters. Give or take 5, 314. The first 3 digits of pi, some dismissed it as pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful patterns where none exist. But then an electrical engineer in Chicago joined the discussion. He pointed out that a spacing of 314 centimeters corresponds almost exactly to one wavelength of a signal in the 95 megahertz range, a frequency in the VHF band used today for FM radio and aircraft communication. In the late 19th century, that frequency had no documented use. Marconi's earliest transmissions were still years away. Tesla's wireless demonstrations were dismissed as science fiction. And yet, here were dozens of monuments, placed in a formation that mirrored electromagnetic principles no one was supposed to understand at the time. Were they merely coincidental, or were they built to resonate? Because that word kept returning. Resonance. In physics, every object has a natural frequency, the rate at which it vibrates most efficiently. Tune a fork and it hums. Send radio signals at the right frequency and an antenna sings. In a system built for transmission or reception, spacing isn't decoration. It's design. It matters. It determines how signals move, how energy flows, how power resonates. The granite used in most of these monuments was consistent, dense, crystalline, ideal for anchoring weight and dampening vibration. The surfaces were flat, not weathered, not chiseled, but machine-level flat. The bolt patterns were symmetrical, the threaded holes were exact. Nothing about this was random. It was infrastructure disguised as grief. The stones point toward Greenwich. They are spaced with precision. They are mounted for load-bearing. And they are anchored in ground chosen not for sentiment, but for geometry. Why wasn't this noticed before? Because who questions a tombstone, even if it's 3 meters tall, even if it has a bolt hole at the top, even if it weighs 4 tons and has no known funding source? As long as there's a name and a date, it's assumed to be a grave. And graves are sacred. Graves are left alone. But sacredness can be weaponized. A stone that mourns draws no attention. A stone that functions hides behind mourning. The system doesn't just hide in plain sight. It hides in sorrow, in memory, in ritual. And once the functional part, the sphere, the cylinder, the mysterious mounted object is removed, what remains is unremarkable, a silent stone, a monument to nothing, or so it seems. But the survey group kept measuring. They documented the fracture marks where something had been pried away. They recorded the rust-free threading, the unnatural cleanliness. They noted how the mounting holes remained free of debris, as if cleaned intentionally, even recently. And, as the data accumulated, a new understanding dawned. The system wasn't just real, it had been carefully dismantled. The monuments weren't abandoned, they were decommissioned. The infrastructure was taken offline, but the base, heavy, immovable, remained. The question was no longer, were these stones part of something? The answer to that had become clear. The new question was, what exactly was the system designed to do, and why was it taken apart? Because resonance is power, and power, when hidden, always has a purpose. In August of 2021, a man named Marcus Webb submitted a short paper to the survey group's shared folder. At first glance, it looked like a technical memo, 10 pages, diagrams sketched by hand, measurements annotated with engineering shorthand. But the theory it outlined would come to reshape the entire investigation. Webb was no amateur. He had spent over 3 decades designing vibration isolation systems and mounting structures for heavy equipment, generators, turbines, radio towers. He knew exactly what a platform needed to look like to handle resonance, wind shear, and structural loading. And what he saw in the cemetery monuments was familiar, too familiar. These, Webb wrote in the opening paragraph, are not memorials later modified to serve mechanical functions. These are mechanical foundations disguised as memorials. His proposal was simple. The monuments were never intended to be purely symbolic. They were bases, engineered structures designed to anchor something precise and heavy. The granite provided mass, vital for absorbing vibration and grounding electrical resonance. The smooth, flat platforms allowed for consistent mounting. The symmetrical bolt patterns gave physical support. The orientation ensured alignment with whatever larger system they were part of. The inscriptions, names, dates, served a different function entirely. Camouflage. Webb walked through the logic like a blueprint. A stone with a threaded hole doesn't belong in a graveyard. But put a name and death date on that stone, and suddenly no one asks questions. No one examines the mounting pattern. No one wonders why a laborer's grave costs the equivalent of $30,000 in today's currency. Because names silence curiosity. The system was built to hide in grief, to illustrate his point. Webb diagrammed a base from Pittsburgh, comparing it to a standard radio tower footing from the early 20th century. The bolt layout, load tolerance, and dimensions were shockingly close. The only difference was vertical orientation. The tower base rose from open ground. The cemetery base rose from beneath a name. In a follow-up interview with a researcher from Boston, Webb clarified the heart of his hypothesis. "You don't just hide infrastructure in plain sight," he said. "You hide it inside things people will never measure, never disturb. You hide it inside memory." But the monuments alone weren't enough. What mattered was what they once held. The spheres, the cylinders, the mounted objects now vanished. Webb speculated that these were not just passive structures. They were functional, part of a network, a resonant array. He contacted antenna specialists, and together they analyzed the properties of a conductive sphere mounted on a tall, grounded stone base. The conclusions were cautious but suggestive. Such an object could indeed function as a crude capacitor. It could collect atmospheric energy. It could radiate or receive signals. If tuned to a specific frequency, it could even amplify ambient electromagnetic fields, particularly in the presence of nearby infrastructure like telegraph wires. Resonance, they explained, isn't magical. It's physics. Every structure, every material, every system has a frequency where energy transfer becomes efficient. Strike a tuning fork near another fork tuned to the same pitch, and the second fork begins to vibrate. Radio antennas work the same way. They receive not just any signal, but only the one they're tuned to. What the survey group had documented, spacing near 3.14 meters, orientations aligned with the prime meridian, bolt patterns precise to the millimeter, looked, in Webb's view, like a system designed to operate at resonance, specifically, at a frequency near 95 megahertz. And that's where the timeline grew strange. In the 1890s, no publicly known technology operated at that frequency. The science of radio was in its infancy. Tesla's experiments were dismissed as fantastical. Marconi was still tinkering with spark gap transmitters. And yet someone, some institution or group, was installing 3-meter-tall granite pedestals fitted for conductive hardware, spaced at resonant intervals, aligned to a global reference. And then, in the years after the First World War, they dismantled it all. The monuments remained, but the mounted devices disappeared. The threaded holes were left empty. The fractures at the stone apex told of forced removal. And the records, those fragile ghosts of truth, either vanished or lied. Newspaper clippings mentioned obsolete fixtures being removed. Municipal reports described decommissioned memorial ornaments. No further detail was ever given. Who would have done this? Webb offered a theory grounded in experience. Suppressed technology, the kind that gets quietly removed when political winds shift or when its implications become too powerful. He had seen it before. Experimental defense infrastructure decommissioned before it ever reached public understanding. Devices locked behind security clearance. Applications buried under classified patents. The cemetery network, he proposed, may have been part of a forgotten or suppressed telecommunications experiment. Not wire-bound like the telegraph, not dependent on human operators like the switchboards, but passive, ambient, distributed, a whisper of wireless long before wireless was real. The names on the monuments added another layer. Eleanor Marsh, seamstress, Thomas Garrett, telegraph technician, James Whitmore, laborer, or perhaps cable handler, every stone tied back, however faintly, to the industries of communication, to the infrastructure of information flow. These were not just stones. They were legacy, not of individuals, but of systems. Systems designed to connect, to resonate, and, perhaps, to transcend the limitations of their age. Systems that someone decided the world was not ready to remember. Why? Because technology changes culture, and culture changes power. A system that could transmit or receive signals without wires, without towers, without visible infrastructure, would have been revolutionary. And revolutions are dangerous, not to the people, but to the ones who already hold control. Webb's infrastructure hypothesis did not claim to explain every detail. It could not account for every mounting hole or inscription, but it offered a framework, a reason for the precision, a purpose for the pattern, and most of all, it asked a question no one else had dared to pose. What if the dead were not buried beneath memorials? What if they were buried beneath machines? By the end of the First World War, a strange silence had begun to settle over the monumental stones, not a silence of grief, but of removal, deliberate, practiced, and efficient. The mounted objects that once sat atop the platforms, spheres, cylinders, conical shapes, were vanishing. Not crumbling, not rusting, disappearing. And when the survey group examined the sites, they noticed something haunting. It wasn't time that had taken them. It was human hands. They began to shift their focus from what was there to what had been taken. And when they did, the traces lit up like footprints in frost, tool marks at the apex of the stones, where the devices had been pried free. Long, shallow fractures exactly where a crowbar or mechanical jack would apply force. Clean threaded holes with no sign of corrosion, no debris, no remnants of bolts. Holes that should have shown at least some oxidation after a century in the open air, but didn't. That detail was small but telling. The removals weren't ancient. They were recent, at least within the last few generations. And they were surgical. Then came the soil impressions. In a cemetery near Philadelphia, a researcher noticed faint depressions in the grass near a row of oversized monuments, rectangular footprints, 40 by 60 centimeters, each one positioned a meter or two from the base of a stone. The indentations were barely visible, but beneath the layers of leaf litter and sediment, the ground was compacted, deeply, as if something heavy had rested there, repeatedly. A scaffold, a platform, a portable crane, the pattern repeated at other sites. Shallow soil compression, residue of steel tracks, signs of weight distribution that no mourner would ever leave behind. These weren't graveside vigils. They were removal operations. And then came the newspaper fragments. Not headlines, not front-page scandals, just quiet administrative notices buried deep inside local columns. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. March of 1918. Obsolete fixtures removed from Allegheny Cemetery. The Manchester Guardian. September of 1919. Decommissioning of memorial ornaments underway at St. Michael's Churchyard. Short, sanitized, lacking detail, but paired with the physical evidence. They told the truth. Someone had authorized the removal, and someone had approved its silence. The survey group cross-referenced the timeline. The dismantling operations all occurred within a 5-year window, between 1917 and 1922, in Germany, in England, in the United States. Different nations, different languages, the same quiet disappearance. It was a perfect moment to erase something. The world was reeling from war. Governments were reorganizing. Industry was shifting. Materials like copper and bronze were scarce, requisitioned, salvaged, melted down. What better cover for removing hundreds of metal devices mounted in public view? The infrastructure had already been disguised as mourning. Now it could be written off as salvage, as repair, as necessary modernization, and no one asked questions. The survey group noted that dismantling leaves traces, but it also leaves patterns. Most of the fractures at the top of the monuments were clean and angular, consistent with mechanical force, not weathering. The corners where the mounting slots had once gripped metal were chipped, the stone beneath showing a lighter gray, proof that the damage was recent when compared to the lichen-covered exterior. More telling was what wasn't left behind. No remnants of fasteners, no rusted bolts, no oxidized screws lodged in the threads, not even snapped-off stems. Someone had not only removed the hardware, they had cleaned the sites, thoroughly, respectfully, even as if they were undoing something sensitive, something they believed still mattered, and the records, the paper trail, mirrored the stones. Faded, inconsistent, self-contradictory. Cemetery ledgers listed standard headstones where massive platforms now stood. Maintenance reports from the relevant years were either missing entirely or filled with meaningless entries. where the truth should have been recorded. There was noise, where silence should have been innocent. It was filled with edits. Some researchers wondered whether the monuments had been installed without full institutional knowledge. Perhaps a handful of engineers placed the nodes under the cover of public works or cemetery beautification. But if so, the removal phase showed a level of coordination too large to dismiss. The pattern was global, the methods were consistent, the timeline was tight, and the effort was precise. That precision was most visible in the aftermath. The mounting platforms, though empty, were still level, still aligned, still resonant, and the threaded holes, though now devoid of their copper or steel fittings, still pointed upward like question marks carved into stone. The researchers began building a new kind of map, not just where the monuments were, but when they had changed, when the fractures appeared, when the photographs stopped showing the mounted objects. They found that the change spread like a wave, starting in major cities, then sweeping outward toward rural cemeteries and churchyards. Urban centers like Pittsburgh and Manchester were dismantled first. Smaller towns followed. Then the survey data turned to geography. A planning consultant from Edinburgh, Fiona Gallagher, noticed that every monument row, the curved sets of 17, the symmetrical arrays, was within 400 meters of a known telegraph relay station. Not just generally near industrial zones, but adjacent to the very infrastructure responsible for 19th century communication. Telegraphs ran on copper, on pulses, on rhythm. What if the mounted objects had been harvesting that rhythm? Electromagnetic fields radiate from power lines. Weak, yes, but present. With the right design, a grounded base, a conductive mount, a resonant frequency. Those fields can be captured, amplified, perhaps even transmitted. The spheres were not power sources. They were instruments. And when the telegraph fell into obsolescence, replaced by radio and then by telephone, the system lost its feed. The pulses grew faint. The purpose weakened. And someone, somewhere, gave the order. Dismantle it, erase it. Leave no trace but stone, because stone is heavy. Too heavy to move, too solid to smash quietly. But it is also mute. And as long as the devices were gone, the system was gone. The monuments could remain. What remains now are questions. Why was it built? What did it do? Who decided it must disappear? And perhaps most important, who was buried beneath it? Because the final layer of this erasure wasn't physical. It was personal. The names on the stones, the workers, the servants, the ordinary people, were erased not from their graves, but from memory. Their existence reduced to an inscription. Their role in something larger never recorded, never acknowledged, never grieved. Their monuments were machines, and their silence still resonates. The survey group had measured the stones. They had documented the mounts, the threaded holes, the fractures. They had tracked the disappearances, but it was Fiona Gallagher, the Edinburgh urban planning consultant, who asked a different kind of question, one that would crack the investigation wide open. What if the stones weren't just arranged with mechanical logic, but also with geographic intention? Fiona had spent her career studying how cities were built, where rail lines converged, how water mains curved with the land, how telegraph lines threaded themselves between industry and government. She understood that infrastructure didn't follow beauty, it followed function. And when she overlaid the known monument sites onto historical maps from the late 1800s, something extraordinary emerged. 84% of the confirmed oversized monument rows lay within 800 meters of a major infrastructure hub active during the final decades of the 19th century. Telegraph relay stations, rail depots, electrical substations, industrial waterworks, and not in random proximity, they were nestled alongside, like shadow companions to the pulse of the city. The other 16%, sites where the infrastructure had been demolished, where the modern map showed parks or buildings or empty lots, but on period maps, the pattern held. Every single one of those vanished stations had once pulsed with energy, data, or flow. She refined her data set, narrowed her lens, focused only on the 17 monument arrays, those tightly curved rows with identical mounts and spacing. These were the clearest examples, the most uniform in build and alignment. She examined all known instances from Pennsylvania, England, and Germany, and the finding was absolute. Every single 17-monument row sat within 400 meters of a documented 19th century telegraph relay station. Every single one. It was no longer theory. It was cartographic truth, and it pointed to a deeper connection, one that reached beyond mourning and memory and into the electric bones of a forgotten network. The 19th century telegraph system was the first global web, a lattice of copper wires stretched across cities, continents, and oceans. It transmitted more than news. It transmitted power, not in the way modern power lines do, but in small, regular pulses, electrical signals, rhythmically sent and received, forming a steady hum across the landscape. And those pulses didn't vanish at the wire's edge. They radiated, faintly but consistently, into the surrounding space, into soil, into air, into stone. What if the monuments were designed to catch that echo? A conductive sphere atop a grounded pedestal, spaced in geometric intervals, oriented toward a global fixed point that is the design not of a gravestone, but of a resonator, a passive receiver, a system component waiting for signal. And if that system was placed near telegraph lines, it could, in theory, feed off their emissions, drawing just enough charge to function. Quietly, reliably, invisibly. The survey group began mapping the growth of telegraph lines in the late 1800s. The overlap with monument arrays was uncanny. Wherever a node was built, Manchester, Pittsburgh, Leipzig, a monument cluster appeared, not haphazardly, not gradually, but within a few years of the station's construction. The system expanded as the wires did. Gallagher's findings grew even more provocative when she layered into temporal data. The construction of these oversized monuments tracked perfectly with the peak of the telegraph's influence, roughly 1860 to 1915. After that, the network began to wane, replaced by the telephone and radio, and the monuments, they stopped appearing, even more tellingly. The removals, documented by fractures, missing mounts, newspaper scraps, all occurred within a decade of the telegraph's global decline. Between 1917 and 1922, the system didn't just stop, it was shut down. Why? The survey group debated endlessly. Perhaps the technology had been a secret military experiment, piggybacking on the public telegraph system. Perhaps it had been a private innovation, quietly tested under cover of funerary disguise. Or perhaps it was something older, something inherited and maintained until the modern age rendered it obsolete or dangerous. Regardless of origin, one fact was becoming clear. The monuments were part of the infrastructure, not symbolic of it, part of it. They weren't there to honor the dead. They were installed in locations chosen for signal proximity, spatial efficiency, and electromagnetic exposure, and that exposed a darker layer. What of the names beneath the stone, the people buried beneath the platforms? Some researchers began to fear the answer. Because if the location of the graves was selected for technical reasons, then the people may not have been buried because they died there, but buried there because the system needed a stone, a base, a body, a cover. The inscriptions weren't the reason for the stones. They were the justification. And if the names were real, they may have been carefully chosen. Workers in the telegraph industry, cable handlers, relay operators, people who already existed in the network and who, in death, became part of it in a far more literal way. One document unearthed from a regional church archive in Yorkshire hinted at this possibility. A burial entry from 1885 listed a man named Francis W., under cause of death as natural causes, but in the margin, a notation read, placement confirmed, paid in full, non-familial. It was a strange phrase. Placement confirmed. As if burial were part of a plan, not grief. It raised the specter of something darker. Sacrifice not in ritual, but in protocol. A network not just hidden beneath mourning, but built upon it. Gallagher, haunted by her findings, wrote in a group message, "We're not just measuring stones anymore. We're tracing corridors, power corridors. And every time we find one, it leads back to copper and wire and pulse and silence." That silence, once thought to be death, now sounded like design, because what if the dead weren't the only ones buried? What if the technology was buried too? For months, The survey group had approached the monuments as data points, structures to be measured, photographed, analyzed. They logged base thicknesses and bolt diameters, debated electromagnetic frequency ranges, and overlaid maps in translucent digital layers. But it was a new member, Eleanor Chen, who reminded them that these weren't just stones, they were graves, and every grave, no matter how strange, once belonged to a person. Chen wasn't an engineer. She was a genealogist by trade, someone who spent her life helping families find missing branches on their ancestral trees. She joined the group in September of 2021, quietly at first, reading the documents, observing the discussions, and then one evening, she posted a message that would shift the tone of the entire project. "These names," she wrote, "has anyone tried to find their families?" The answer was no. Not really. Most members had been so focused on the physical anomalies, the threaded holes, the missing spheres, the architectural patterns, that the names had become secondary. They were treated like labels, not legacies. Chen, however, saw something else. She saw people. She began with one of the earliest names mentioned in the investigation, Eleanor Marsh, whose monument stood in the Pennsylvania Row of 17, dated 1883. The cemetery ledger listed her burial as paid in full, no family contact. No birth certificate existed in Allegheny County, no probate record, no obituary. But Chen widened her search. In the federal census of 1880, just across the county line in Westmoreland, she found an Eleanor Marsh, age 26, occupation, domestic servant, living in the household of a family named Thornton. The Thornton family owned a small manufacturing business that produced telegraph insulators. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread. She followed others. Thomas Garrett, another name from the Pennsylvania Row, had no grave record beyond the monument. But an 1878 employee roster from Western Union's Pittsburgh office listed a Thomas Garrett as a junior relay technician. James Whitmore, whose oversized stone had launched the entire mystery, was recorded in an 1885 Pittsburgh City Directory. His occupation: cable technician. Employer: American Telegraph Supply. Margaret Holloway, buried beneath a monument dated 1887, was listed in an 1884 church registry as the wife of Frederick Holloway, a telegraph engineer who had died 3 years earlier. Margaret, too, vanished from the record after his death, until her name reappeared carved into granite. Chen found 4 connections, 4 out of 17, 4 lives tied not by coincidence, but by wire. She proposed a theory, tentative, but profound. The people buried beneath the oversized monuments weren't random. They were participants, workers within the telegraph network, men and women whose daily lives involved electromagnetic infrastructure. When they died, suddenly, unexpectedly, or alone, their bodies became part of that system. Their burials were arranged, their stones installed not just to remember them, but to utilize them, not in a mystical sense, in a physical, logistical sense. Their graves became nodes. The phrase in the cemetery ledger, paid in full, no family contact, took on new weight. It was not a reflection of poverty, it was policy. Someone paid, someone made the arrangements, and someone ensured that the family stayed away. It reframed everything. These monuments weren't just infrastructure hidden behind mourning. They were infrastructure that consumed mourning. The death of a technician became an opportunity. The grieving process became a delivery system. The burial became a blueprint. The survey group was shaken. The tone of their internal discussion shifted. They stopped speaking about the equipment as merely technical. They started using names, started asking about people, not just what they did in life, but what was done with them in death. It changed how they read the fractures on the monuments. No longer just signs of removal, but perhaps violations, unburials, dismantlings not of machines, but of memorials. And it deepened their questions. Did the deceased know? Did they agree? Did they consent to have their deaths folded into a secret system that spanned continents? Probably not, because the records were careful, too careful. And where the records ended, silence began. No correspondence, no explanation, no trace of grief. But the traces of manipulation were everywhere. Burial registers that listed simple headstones for stones that towered over 3 meters. death certificates that failed to mention burial locations, maps that labeled filled plots as vacant, inconsistencies so consistent. They revealed intention. And what of the families, the children who stood before these stones, not knowing that their loved ones had become foundations for something else? The widows who brought flowers to a monument designed not just to mourn, but to function? Their mourning had been used. Chen called it a quiet betrayal, one that had gone unnoticed for over a century, not because it was small, but because it had been hidden inside something sacred. Graves are not questioned. They are tended, protected, believed, but belief can be a blindfold, and mourning, if hijacked, can become a machine. By the end of autumn, the survey group had changed. They no longer spoke of the monuments as devices. They called them witnesses, because that's what they had become, not just remnants of a forgotten network, but markers of a hidden choice, a decision made by someone, somewhere, to bury people beneath technology, to turn cemeteries into grids, to turn grief into circuitry. The names were not inscriptions. They were the last remnants of identity, names that survived erasure, names that resisted being folded entirely into function. And as Eleanor Chen wrote in a message that brought the group to a long, haunted silence, they didn't just bury infrastructure in these cemeteries, they buried people, and they buried the truth with them. In early December of 2021, the survey group received an unexpected message. It came not from a researcher or engineer, but from a retired archivist in the British National Archives. She had been following their work quietly, without comment. But now she had something to say. "Your pattern is real," she wrote. "I've seen the gaps. I know where some of them lead. But you're looking in the wrong archives. The answers aren't in cemetery records. They're in engineering files, military files, and patent applications that were never published." She gave them a name: Harold Vance Ashford. The group sprang into motion. Search engines yielded little. No biography, no obituary, but in the British Patent Index, he appeared exactly 3 times, once in 1881, again in 1884, and finally in 1887. All 3 filings bore a rare stamp, reviewed, not for public registry. That mark was critical. It meant the patents had been examined, but were withheld from publication, suppressed, hidden. Patents are normally public by design. They exist to share innovation in exchange for temporary protection. But governments can intervene. If an invention is deemed strategically sensitive, military, communications, energy-related, it can be classified, buried, forgotten by design. Ashford's patents had been buried for over a century. Though the group couldn't access the patents directly, they began pulling peripheral documents, correspondence, internal memos, requisition forms, scattered across various government departments. What emerged was the shadow of something large. A letter dated March 1884 from Ashford to the British General Post Office referenced the installation of receiving apparatus at designated memorial sites throughout the northern counties. Not military sites, not laboratories, memorial sites. A Royal Engineers requisition form from November 1886 ordered a shipment of granite pedestals, specification A7, intended for signal relay purposes. The delivery address? A cemetery near Manchester, and a memorandum from the War Office, dated February 1892, described the decommissioning of experimental communication infrastructure installed during the prior decade. It did not list what that infrastructure was, only where, at distributed memorial installations, northern and western sectors. Or the document stopped short of naming the system or describing its full function, but they confirmed the sequence. Something had been installed, something had operated, and something had been removed, quietly, deliberately, completely. Ashford vanished from public life in 1893. No death certificate, no public obituary. His last known correspondence was a 1-line telegram to the General Post Office. It read simply, "Phase complete, awaiting further instruction." The survey group attempted to reconstruct what the Ashford patents may have described, based on the mounting configurations, spacing data, and material residues. 2 main hypotheses emerged. Hypothesis 1, a passive signal relay system. In this version, The spheres functioned as ambient receivers. Telegraph signals sent through copper lines created electromagnetic fields. These fields, weak though they were, radiated outward. A conductive sphere, properly mounted and grounded, could, in theory, capture that residual energy and retransmit it at a slightly altered frequency. This would extend signal range, allowing communication between stations with fewer wires. A ghost network riding the bones of the main system. Hypothesis. 2. A wireless communication grid. If Ashford had been working independently of Marconi and Tesla, it's possible he discovered similar principles through a different route. The monuments may have formed a low-power wireless communication grid, transmitting coded pulses between aligned nodes. If the signals were low frequency and short range, the system could remain hidden, undetectable to conventional instruments of the time. It would have been crude by modern standards, but for 1890, revolutionary. In both cases, the stones were essential, not symbolic, not decorative, functional. The granite bases were designed not to impress, but to stabilize, to anchor vibration, to ground resonance. The inscriptions were not for families. They were for cover. The removal records supported this. The same tone, the same language. Decommissioned ornaments, obsolete fixtures. The same administrative coldness used to dismantle lighthouses, semaphore towers, early rail signals. Functional things, once useful, now inconvenient. And then came the final blow. A transmission log uncovered in the archives of the British Army's Signals Corps, dated November 1920. It described final sweep of northern arrays, all components secured, platforms left undisturbed per standing directive. Undisturbed. The platforms, the monuments, were to remain, stone too heavy to move, too visible to destroy. But the mounted devices, removed, logged, discarded, buried. The survey group now had confirmation. The monuments were part of a system. That system was experimental, likely governmental, possibly military. It operated in secret, disguised as memorials. It was installed with precision and removed with care, and no one, not the families, not the public, was ever told. The final core file compiled by the group listed 3 case studies. Case 1, Pennsylvania, 17 monuments, 4-point bolt patterns. Orientation, 71 degrees east of north. Distance to nearest telegraph station, 340 meters. Inscriptions tied to telegraph employees. Cemetery records falsified. Case 2. Manchester, England, 11 monuments, same dimensions, same mounting structure, distance to station, 410 meters. Burial register inconsistent with visible stones. Case 3. Leipzig, Germany, 17 monuments again, present in pre-construction photographs. Omitted from architectural plans. 4-point mounts, same copper oxidation, alignment toward Greenwich, 3 languages, 3 nations, 3 distinct administrative systems, and yet the same specs, the same geometry, the same erasures, the probability of chance nearly 0. The group reached its final conclusion, not in certainty, but in synthesis. The monuments were components, the graves were covers, the families were never told. The technology was real, and someone, at the highest levels, had decided it was never meant to be remembered. Why? Perhaps the system proved unstable, or threatening, or simply ahead of its time. But, more likely, it became dangerous in another way, to the order of things, a passive network. No wires, no operators, no infrastructure visible above ground. It bypassed cost, bypassed control, bypassed surveillance. That kind of system frightens those who manage power. So, they took it, and left behind the weight of memory carved in stone.